Hi, everyone. Hey, good afternoon. Hey, Renaud. So, I have the pleasure to interview you today. So I will have my little list of questions here that I prepare for you. But before we get there, I think it might be interesting for everybody here who's not an Eventbrite user that you give us maybe just a short snapshot of what is Eventbrite before we go into more questions.
Well, everybody is an Eventbrite user because the ticketing was done through Eventbrite for this event. I have the privilege of having you all as customers, so feel free to send your feedback anytime. We started Eventbrite about 13 years ago, early 2006, exactly for this purpose, to bring people together through live experiences. We've achieved quite a bit over these last 13 years. Last year we had about almost 4 million events organized on the platform, processed 265 million tickets, I think, all over the world in 170 countries. We started in San Francisco. We have a big team in Europe now, in South America as well, and in Australia. About 1,000 employees, and a pretty big platform that helped us along the way, and that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk about platform. And before we jump in, I think maybe might be interesting for the people out there.
Tell us more about your career as well.
Yeah, okay, all right. So I also work with platforms, and that's what I was going to say. That's why it's going to be interesting. But I come from the product side, where you come from the tech side. And there's always this tension between the two, so it should be an interesting conversation. Actually, without going too far back, before I was in the music industry, I was in the mapping and automotive industry, working on autonomous driving and connected cars. And when I did enough of that, I moved into the music industry, work with SoundCloud, and now I joined Native Instrument. And what is interesting is, like, whether it was in the transportation business or in the music industry, I still always end up working with platforms. So I guess there must be something there that sticks to me. Good. So that being said, and beside the fact that we are two French guys in Germany, and we're not going to do that in French, but why we could eventually. But let's jump right into it. And actually, the first question I would like to ask is, like, how did it all started? Like, what was the first thing that developers have built using your API at that time, or whatever it was that you offered them?
So we launched the company in 2006, and we had quite a bit of organic adoption fairly early on, from the tech events in San Francisco, mostly at the beginning, to tech events in New York, in London, in other places, and then to other types of events. At that time, there were a few event discovery platforms. So there was Eventful, I think Oodle was popular at the time. So the first use for the API was to help our event organizers and push the content that they were creating on our platform, which is all the events and their tickets, to these distribution partners that we wanted to work with, because that's something our users were doing manually already. They were copy-pasting the event name, the event time, the address into these other platforms. So we thought, why don't we build a simple discovery API that will update automatically if you make any changes on Eventbrite. It will push all these changes to discovery platforms that we were connecting with. The discovery platforms needed our content because their sole purpose is to list a list of events, basically based on your search. So there was a natural fit for that to be our first API that we launched. And we launched that in 2008. It was our event search API. I think I wrote that one. We had to build a few things along before that to make it possible to have an API. So I think at the time, our security was very basic. You actually had to enter your username and password in the URL to get access to this API. So it shows you how immature API technologies in general were. And it was a very different time, 2008. I think we were just starting to talk about APIs. So keep that in mind. Like, the newbies or the recent software engineers in the room might think that APIs have existed forever, but that's definitely not the case. They are very popular now, but when we started, it wasn't the case.
Great. So going back in time, I think what is important is also what lies behind the API. And basically, I would like to understand what was the architecture at that time, and then how you evolved the architecture, what were the main issue you faced evolving your architecture to what it is today.
So at that time, we were a very much product-focused company. We wanted to solve a problem for event organizers, which was make it as easy as possible for anyone, anywhere in the world to sell tickets. The ecosystem around it, we knew very little about. We discovered it as we went building the product, but it was not a focus. So the API in its basic form at the beginning, and I think that actually lasted for 5 or 6 years, was one file in our code base. It was called API pages.py, and it did everything: authentication, rate limiting, app creation. All the API calls were in there, so it was very unsophisticated and definitely not a focus for us at the beginning. We were in the growth phase. We wanted to build the best product for our audience, and really thinking about the API and the platform, or it will become the platform for us, as a small extension in a corner that wasn't really worth putting too much time in. So we kept adding a few things here and there because our clients asked for them. I think after the Discovery API, we added an ability for the event creators to pool their attendee data. They wanted to populate their CRM or send emails to MailChimp or other things like that. So we made that possible. But that's very much how we built this early stage platform, was to answer specific needs that our customer had that we could solve through APIs that we would launch.
Okay, so bouncing back on that, because it's interesting, what is the most surprising thing that any developer has built with your API?
Well, I think that was the most surprising thing. When we had these few key APIs launched, it was an open API, so anyone could sign up, create an app key, and start making calls. To gain access to an organizer's content, they had to get authentication and these things, permission granted to access that data. But I think you guys and everyone in this room is a developer at heart and a creator also. And we were very surprised by the type of applications that were built on top of it. I remember one that was like a physical hardware device that would be installed on the street, and that would let you, as you walk past, see events that were happening around you, like within a small perimeter. So things we didn't really think would work necessarily, but they were very creative in putting things together. And I think the best applications became actual products that triggered like companies to be built around them. Like Slido is a good example of a company that took our APIs and other companies' APIs as well, but built a sophisticated tool for engagement at events that we would not or did not have time to build and were not part of our core roadmap. So that's what's been really exciting and triggered our thinking that maybe there was more beyond our core product, that we can leverage all this energy of the developing community to build other businesses around us to make us stronger in the end.
Okay, and now also thinking back about that time, what do you think were the big mistakes that you have done at that time that you would give an advice to not do today?
So times have changed. I think nobody built APIs first at the time when we were building Eventbrite. So we didn't build our product on top of APIs. Now we are, but that shift took a long time. So at the beginning, the API was something on the side that had no shared common logic with the rest of the site. So quickly, it started lagging behind. A lot of features that were built in the product were never made it to the API. So I would say treating your platform as a second-class citizen compared to your main product is probably the main failure of a lot of companies that will bite them in the end. It's really easy to do that because you're focused on getting traction, getting your first customers happy, and not really thinking long-term of how we're going to build this ecosystem. So I think there's trade-offs, but now that pretty much everyone is building new software based on APIs first, then that question doesn't really come as a problem, I think, anymore. The main decision now is whether you open or not. I think once you open, you have a contract with developers that you need to honor. So it makes iterations a lot slower. It forces you to have versioning policies and a lot of process around API creation. So understand the downside of having a public open API because it does have an impact on your business.
Yep. Absolutely. So now, just talking about this ecosystem of partner and developer that you have, how do you bring trust into this ecosystem? How do you keep the ecosystem vibrant? How do you really make sure that they stick to the platform, right? Because they are at the core of what you do. Without them, platform is a bit useless. So how do you make that happen? What's the trick?
Well, I think the first pillar is reliability and performance. People are building businesses around your APIs, around your platform. Your customers are relying on these pieces of software to be running efficiently and all the time. Like our biggest application for our APIs is probably the check-in management at the door. Like when you're lining up at the entrance of the event, if your system is down, then you have 10,000 people waiting in the rain, and that's definitely not an acceptable experience. So we spent a lot of time instrumenting and building a scalable infrastructure for our APIs, and that's, I think, the first pillar. The second pillar is documentation and communication. So having a documentation that makes sense, and for the longest time we had very poor documentation, I have to admit. It was not treated as a product. We didn't really understand the developers who were interacting with them. Now we have a brand new developer platform, APIs all fairly well documented, and if they're not, we hope that you will tell us. And then in the end, it's about communication of changes, of evolution. Like we changed our data models often, and if you don't communicate and work with your partners to upgrade their systems at the same time as yours, then slowly but surely your ecosystem is getting smaller instead of getting bigger. And then encourage use. I think once you have these two pillars in, then you need to actively search the right partners, the right distribution partners, the right complements to your product so that you can build a great competitive advantage for your business. And in the end, I think that's what we have today.
So maybe working on that a little bit or getting a little bit deeper, do you think, what is the most, and I don't want to ask a tricky question, but what do you think is the most important today? Is it the partner you work with or is it the developer that you work with? I mean, if you want to make the difference, maybe it's worth explaining what's the difference between the two and then explaining how do you deal with both differently, right? Because they are different kind of animals. So how do you deal with them?
So I think that's the shift that we made 3-4 years ago when we started realizing the potential for the platform. Instead of letting third-party developers discover it by themselves, try to think of solutions, we co-developed solutions with specific companies. And it starts, I think, on the biz dev side, not necessarily on the developer side, especially for partners that create products around your product. So there it starts with discussions on both sides. What are we trying to achieve? Who are we trying to achieve that for? How are we going to price it? How are we going to share the pricing that we generate from one side or the other? Those can take time and should be thought through well, because the experience that you provide your users with these integrations is really important, and that's almost as if you were building your own product. So you have to treat it like a project, build a roadmap for it, make sure you have the resources and the right APIs on both sides to make it successful, and then monitor the partnership over the long term to make sure the incentives are still aligned, that it generates the type of return you were expecting, and then keep finding the right partners to extend.
And maybe going back...
I'm actually curious, what was SoundCloud's evolution from a product to a platform as well? Because that's what you work for it, right?
Yeah, so SoundCloud was interesting in a way. I mean, we were both serving end user by providing basically a streaming app where you can listen to music. We're also working on the other side of the spectrum with a creator who are bringing their music and distributing their music through the SoundCloud platform. So we had already to do that match between demand and supply. And just to add a little bit of complexity to that, we also had to build to work with partners, which is the labels. Basically, you manage the royalty of any track, because when you start distributing any track that has some royalty attached to it, you need to work with the labels. And then basically, it started very much with the labels as a burden, because you have to pay, you have to organize all that, pay the royalties, and work with them. So it's very much a tense relationship at the beginning. But then when you start building what we discussed before, this like win-win solution with a partner where they see a value, then the conversation become much more interesting. And in the case of SoundCloud, it was very much giving access to the labels to emerging talents and being able to basically find with our community within SoundCloud, like discover who are the talents of tomorrow and bring them very early in the spotlight and share that with our partners. And that was important for us to have this win-win, to move into a win-win solution instead of being basically just paying fees and seeing that as a burden, reporting and paying. So that's really the evolution of SoundCloud. And of course, there are other partnerships, but with are more marketing driven around branding and everything. But I see really working with the label was pretty interesting and a real change that happened within SoundCloud. Yeah, and I was also wondering, going back to this partner and developer, it's always tricky. What comes first, right? It's a little bit of a chicken and egg. Do you think the partner come because you have a lot of developers? Do you think the developer come because there's a lot of partner? You know, this whole idea of how you maintain the right balance within your ecosystem, which is it's always tricky. It's both organic, but you can also influence that. So I'm very interested within Eventbrite. Like, how do you manage to keep that balance?
So I think you have to manage stakeholders, and there are many stakeholders that we can group maybe to illustrate what the attention should be. So we have our distribution partners. So these would be Facebook, Spotify. We have 50 of them, I think, that take our inventory and sell tickets for us on their platform. So Facebook, for example, has native buy of tickets directly in their interface of our events through an exchange that we do on the back end for payments. Spotify is a redirect, so we have many of these distribution partners. Those, we're interested in their reach, they're interested in our inventory, so it's a very easy deal to have. The main key point there is the easiness of the integration, I would say. Then we have the additional products. Usually it's smaller companies who want access to our customers. So they build things like check-in management or CRM systems or other things that they know we're not going to build. And there it's for us to decide whether they are the right partner or not. They usually are much smaller than us. They want access to our customers. So we have the upper hand and we can negotiate there for them to work with us or not. Then we have all the APIs that we build for our event creators. Like, they have needs as well. They want to do things. They want to create their own dashboard. They want to create, I don't know, all kinds of reporting and integrations themselves because they have also complex businesses to run. So for those, we have a very direct conversation with them. We try to understand how they do their business every day, what type of products they're using outside of us, and make our data available to them for use in whatever form they want. So if these three main key stakeholders, I think, have to be managed differently, and it's different conversations with different types of people. So I think for our customers, it's product folks mostly talking to them. For distribution partners, it's biz dev or marketing in a way. Yeah. And then for products that are built on top of us, it's pure biz dev in the end.
Okay, so maybe another question I'm interested, like putting my product hat here, is like, how do you manage with all these stakeholders? How do you manage to define what makes it to the roadmap? How you prioritize between all this demand that are coming from all these different stakeholders?
So that's a good question. I would say monetization is not our first priority for the platform. Our first priority is make sure we have something that retains the customer. And yes, there are a lot of ticketing companies out there, but there's very few companies that have 100+ integrations with the biggest software providers in the world, the Salesforce, the MailChimp, et cetera, et cetera. So once you build this ecosystem that is reliant upon every day by these businesses to run their organizations, then we see that as a very clear competitive advantage. So I think that's the prism we look at. Same with our distribution partners. Like, there's very few companies out there that can distribute your ticket in 50 different partners out there and let the consumers buy wherever they're on whatever app they're using. So I would say that's the first prism that we look at. How much retention can we expect from providing this feature inside the API versus in product?
Okay.
Not necessarily.
So it's really retention driven. It's all about the stickiness of your platform and making sure that you
keep... It's stickiness first, monetization later, but it hasn't been a big focus for us.
Okay. And do you suffer from this typical everything needs to be built in-house, or are you also looking at what's out there that complement your offer and starting to look more into like, okay, I can bring that in, or I'm just curious on how you grow. Is it purely organic? Is it opportunistic? Is it whole in-house? Are you looking outside? How do you grow?
I mean, a lot of the demand comes from our customers using different pieces of software or wanting to use these pieces of software. So that drives the initial conversation. Then it's for us to make a choice philosophically of where we want our inventory to be available. So that's what drove the distribution partner discussions. And then it's how you put it together and what you want to focus on. So far we've been very focused on providing the best ticketing technology. We haven't really focused on helping event creators better market their events or production of the event. That's another entire new sector that we haven't tackled, but other companies have. So can we just integrate with the right ones in order to be still holding the key information, which is the relationship between organizers and yourselves, but being able to do your work throughout every task that you have to do as an event organizer as smoothly as possible.
Yeah, cool. So let's now we've looked in the past. We look at how you came to where you are. Now maybe let's look in the future, what's coming in the world of platforms, and looking at your expertise here. And so what do you say, or what do you see are big trends in the world of platforms, and what are you especially excited about?
Well, I think inevitably, if you have a lot of data, you're going to be forced to have a platform strategy. I think data wants to be free and wants to talk to other data out there. So think about how you're going to open, what you're going to open, how you control access. I think some companies along the way have gone too far in opening up. Facebook got bit, I think, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal of opening too much data and giving their partners too much power. So we live in a strange world where there's a lot of data and you own that data, but in the end, it's still controlled by a third party. So this is more about strategy, how you think about strategy down the line. Practically, in terms of development, I think most companies nowadays build APIs first, so that's great. It makes it super easy to create or to open your data, at least. I think we'll see the return of the widget, and when I say that, it's the front end is still being built very much in a product-focused manner where you're thinking about your product and not necessarily building each component inside these products as things that could be embedded into another product. If I think of the creation of an event on the Eventbrite platform, for example, there's no reason that couldn't happen in another site, on a newspaper site, for example, if they want to create an advertising for events there. Could we power that with 2 lines of JavaScript and code that would be exactly the same as we run? Most likely. I think it's an approach that few people have taken, but I see that as, I mean, Stripe did it for checkout, for example, and a lot of other companies are building front-end components instead of letting you do all the hard work of taking APIs and creating an interface on top of it. So that's one area I'm particularly excited about, and I think you could just provide React components or Vue components or things that are a bit like what we've seen on the native side, but do it on the JavaScript side as well.
Yeah, I guess I totally second that. I mean, everybody who's running an organization, and we were discussing about that also just before, is just like, it's kind of interesting when you look at your team setup, where basically the velocity of your back-end team as compared with your front-end is always amazing. I mean, with difference, but it's always, the bottleneck seems to always happen in the front end. So if we can help fix that, that would be nice.
Need more resources there.
Yeah, but yeah.
What are the big learnings for you for having worked in 3 different companies on platform initiatives? Like,
I think one of the big learning is like it's back to what you were saying, and that's also something we should discuss a little bit more. Is this like it's very interesting because ultimately people don't or company don't think about platform first. It's still fairly new, and every company I've been with, it's very much if I dramatize a little bit, what happened is like company have a good understanding of what is the infrastructure piece, so what you need as a foundation. People understand pretty well the application layer, and then basically they start putting a label platform of everything that sits in the middle. And that's more like a bucket or a sink, if you want. That's a kitchen sink. Let's put everything that doesn't fit into these 2 buckets that we know very well. Let's call that a platform, and that will go. So I actually found myself more often than I wished being faced with that. Like, here it is. You get the platform now. Figure it out. Make it a product.
Lucky you.
Yeah, it's kind of a fun journey. It's a lot of education, actually. So I would say one big learning for me is like how much you need to educate the people about what is a platform, and start, as you were saying, treating it as a product. Whether you are internal customer or external customer, eating your own dog food, using the API internally, and start educating, because the power of the platform is it's very important, but it's only there if you really treat it as a product. And that's the big learning for me. And maybe asking you back the question, and I know we're looking in the future, but like let's I'm very interested, like, on this question. Did you start Eventbrite by saying, like, and I know the answer, so it's not a curveball. Like, did you start by saying, yeah, we're going to build the best platform, or did it just happen and then you just jump on the opportunity? Walk us a little bit through the process, how you got there.
I mean, platforms were not really a concept at the time. So we had utility platforms. I think those existed, the PayPals and others that focused on providing developers with utility that made sense. So I think Twilio and those started not too long after. But no, we were definitely building a product, not opening up any data. So we just went on with the changing trends, and having more and more data forced us to make that data available. So I think that's the biggest driving function for us, transforming ourselves slowly from a product company, I would say, to a platform company. And we're still in transition, so we haven't fully switched over to being a platform company, but it's definitely a focus. If you read our S1, for example, before the IPO, there's a very long section about what we see as the potential for the platform. One example that we launched recently is if you go on Facebook in the US and create an event, now you have the option to have paid tickets for your event. That's not a feature that Facebook powers, it's a feature that we power. We couldn't have done that without having that platform vision and talking to the teams at Facebook and working on a deal to make that happen. And that took at least 3 months of negotiation plus 6 months of building, so it's not a short-term project that you can't staff on the side like that. So it's been very evolutionary, and I think it's going to be the case for many companies. Take advantage of the opportunities, realize the potential that you have of making that data available to third parties, find the right customers for this product, because it's really a product, and then treat these customers as real customers and think about them in the journey, the product journey, optimize that for their first time to integration, for example. That's one key metric we look at. Is our documentation self-explanatory enough that someone can make an API call within the first 5 minutes? Or I can't remember what our goal is there.
Yeah, but that's one of your key KPI. Basically, you're looking at what's the level of abstraction and how is it easy to use?
No, the first KPI is the number of organizers who use more than 3 integrations through the API. because we really want to be sticky, and we found that people who have 3 integrations or more tend to stay longer.
Okay.
So that's really our focus, and it's creating this ecosystem that's vibrant, that's being thought about and fed regularly so that we have the right solutions for the right problems for our clients.
Okay.
And then after that, it's for the developer, like how easy it is to use our product, because that's what's going to make the development time as short as possible and the integration live as quickly as possible, which benefits everyone.
Absolutely. I think bottom line for platform, it's all about scalability, reliability, and level of abstraction. I think that's always a 3 KPI I keep pushing.
Yep.
And it resonates fairly well, and I think you're talking exactly about the same thing. I would like to ask you a question, going back into the future. What is the craziest idea that you can think about that you think is going to become a reality in 5 to 10 years in the world of platform? If you were to have a magic wand and take us 5 years down the line, what do you think will be something that we think is just not possible today, and that's going to be just commonplace tomorrow or in 5 years down the line?
Well, my personal dream as a developer is to be able to tell my computer what integration to build vocally. So tell them to understand an API enough that they can translate what I'm saying to connecting the right dots between different API endpoints. It's already possible through drag and drop. I think there's a few companies trying to tackle that with no-code integrations. But once you get to the stage where you can actually tell the computer what to build in terms of integration and it just works, that's going to be magical. Same for UIs, I think. We spend way too much time designing login pages. I should be able to direct my computer to build the graphical interface a bit more to the right, a bit bigger, put it higher, and then it transforms into code at this point.
That's an interesting view. So basically just sitting there and just telling your computer to do the work?
Yeah, there's no reason to tickle with all this complex code for no reason, especially for things that are so cookie cutter. And I think API integration should be as cookie cutter as possible.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thought. I hope everything worked like that. I would love to just sit there and just ask computer to do things. That would be nice. But it's interesting, like going back into what I've done before, that's kind of the paradigm of autonomous driving, right? You just jump in and tell them, like, tell the car, take me there, go there. And from inside, it's just interesting how much complexity there is behind that. And it's always the big thing in design or user experience is like how difficult it is to make the user experience easy. And what you are describing is exactly that. Is a user experience as a developer. I just don't want to go through the hurdles of typing and coding. I just want to be able to actually have a conversation with a computer and iterate on that.
Or the designers should be able to do it themselves.
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done around that from a design perspective and UX. But like I think where it's probably more 10 years than 5 years, but like let's see what happened there. Interesting. Now maybe as a conclusion, and before we take question that there might be some question that we will be able to see here on the monitor, maybe to leave the audience with a piece of advice. So what would you give as a piece of advice, a takeaway for the people that are listening to us here this afternoon about, like, if they were to go and join a platform company or start a platform company, what would be your piece of advice or pieces of advice?
I would say find these companies that see enough potential in building platforms and join them, because I think the future will be ruled by people who have the data. And we see that already with the few companies that own most of our data. They have immense power. So if your company is not one of them and they don't think in platform terms, I think you will be at a disadvantage in the future. So maybe it's not super positive advice, but like question your management if they're not thinking about how to extend your product beyond your confines and integrate with the rest of the world out there. There's just too much data out there that's relevant for any business to not have at least a decent strategy around that.
And building up on that, how important do you think it is to look at this company you want to join or you want to start, but basically how important it is to play in this open, like, you know, the open versus closed. We always have these, when you start building a platform, it's always a key question that you ask. And you mentioned that, like, how open do you want to be? So where do you think we are going with that direction about open or not open, a closed ecosystem versus open ecosystem? And if you have a piece of advice or a personal preference, where would that be?
I mean, open has always been our preference. I think closed gardens can have very much a lot of power, but they still need to, they will do private integrations maybe. So they will still have APIs. They might not just be open to anyone. And we have a few APIs like that that are just open to specific partners because of security concerns and card data compliance type of things. But eventually, I think every company will have an open platform that anybody can start on and then take on commercial terms for monetization.
Yeah, which I think I tend to agree with you with, like, I would have a pinch of salt to that. Is like we see GDPR coming in and managing the data and stewardness of the data. And I think that's also bringing a lot of tension with open data ecosystem and open ecosystem. Like, so I think I totally agree with you from an ethos perspective. I think there's a lot of limitation that come with this like scrutiny around the data.
That's where trust is really important, and understanding what data usage is being done with your data. So that's the biggest risk, I think.
Absolutely.